Good morning again. Pardon me while I move to stage center. I like to stand where I think Abraham Lincoln stood in March of 1860 when he spoke on this stage in this beautiful new town hall. We're about to get started with our second speaker of the day, a very special speaker indeed. I just want to take a moment and thank our three wonderful speakers that we just heard from Seacoast Saucers. Regional groups often are the ones that get the big work done as far as I'm concerned and galvanize local populations, build interest, and I don't think there's a more serious topic they could have spoken on. It's also one very close to my heart, the ridicule factor in UFOs and the origin of the ridicule factor. How did it begin? Are subjects that I've lectured on and written on extensively. So I just felt that was not just an outstanding lecture, but a perfect one for us to start on. Okay, our next speaker, Richard M. Dolan, is arguably the highest visibility personage in UFO studies the last number of years. We have living legends like Stanton Friedman, remarkable scholars like Kathleen Martin and Denise Stoner. I don't know anybody who is busier than Richard or more of a self-starter. If you haven't heard him speak, you possibly heard him on any of his own radio shows, other people's radio shows, at conferences, read his books. I think he is one of the most profoundly interesting and important speakers that we have in the field. I had the awful job yesterday of being stuck in a car with him for 8 hours, nothing to say. Don't envy me, not good. He is also one of my dearest friends and closest colleagues, and there was a time, 16, 17 years ago, when he thought he was going to become a regulation issue historian. Focus Cold War American history. Things didn't work out like that. He looked at some documents that had those magic 3 letters on them. His career track jumped the track, and thank God, or we wouldn't have him here today. Without further ado, please welcome my dear friend, close colleague, and ufology's secret weapon, Richard M. Dolan.
I owe him $10 for that lecture, so here you go. Oh, that's a book sale? Okay, whatever. Thank you, Peter. Peter and I had a nice long car ride. We're very close friends, and we drove here together yesterday. Peter and I, we are like the odd couple, I would say. Like, we travel everywhere. I get this, and the other part of our group is Travis Walton, by the way, and he's around here somewhere. Everywhere I go, Peter and Travis and I run into each other. It's like a family reunion. It's very fun. So the good news is I'm thrilled to be here. The little bit of a bad news is that I fried my computer last night. In a moment of genius, I plugged something into the computer that apparently shouldn't have been plugged in, and it just went black. And I thought, that shouldn't be. And so that's going to be our background here. But I've got my lecture. Fortunately, we have smartphones, and I have I have got actually most of the correct lecture on here. I apologize for that. I feel very bad about it, but that's just how it has to be. But it allowed me the opportunity to think about taking even a more fresh approach to what I wanted to talk about here. I do want to chat about thoughts on what is probably a clandestine or secret space program. And it is a subject that's sort of current in the field of UFOs these days. If you've been following the field, you kind of know what I mean. But I think I'll have a couple of other thoughts. And I think maybe toward the end, we might open it up. If you've got some questions, I think it might be a nice change of pace for me. Usually I pack everything that I can into lectures and beyond, and there's no time for questions. So maybe we'll have some time for that. I think that might work out pretty well. We'll see how it goes. As Peter mentioned, long ago, my formal training was in the field of history. And I like to think I was pretty good at it. I studied European and then U.S. diplomatic history pretty intensively for a number of years. Way back in, right after the asteroid killed off the dinosaurs, known as the 1980s. If you remember that, I spent probably 3 or 4 years, almost literally, in the basement of what is called Rush Reed's Library at the University of Rochester, whiling away my 20s. While I thought I should be partying and having fun, I was in this basement reading stacks of dusty books. That's what I did. Thinking I was going to be a historian of U.S. diplomacy, and became obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with the subject of UFOs in the early 90s. And I've never looked back. It's been the wildest journey. One thing that I think I'll mention just while I'm thinking of it, there was a late researcher, debunker, really, Philip J. Klass. Many of you know his name. Klass was the leading skeptic of UFOs for many decades. He was kind of a wise guy, you know, a smart aleck. Loved to smear researchers rather than do genuine research. But one thing Klass always said is that he had a UFO curse. He said, "This is your curse, you believers." He said that when you die, you will be no closer to the truth of this than you are right now. That's my curse, he said. And like a lot of things with Klass, he got most of it basically wrong. And I think he got it wrong on 2 levels. Level number 1 was, it's actually not true that we know less. We are continually researching and deepening our understanding of this phenomenon. It's complex, it's mysterious, absolutely. But we're not where we were in the 1960s. We're not where we were in the 1980s. We are getting deeper and deeper in understanding the complexity of this. So that part is wrong. But the real part where he was wrong, I would say, is on the personal level of this journey. The way I look at it now is this. You know, we as human beings have a certain way that we think about the world. Our brains, our minds are set up in a certain way. Like, you know, you've got your dogs and cats, and they think about reality in a certain way, and we think about it in a different way. But like other animals, we have our limitations, just by virtue of who we are. And so we're dealing with, in my opinion, a reality that is vastly more complex than what our minds really can grasp. It's like when people think about the complexity of God. Well, guess what? The complexity of this subject of UFOs, as one man in the audience just said with this last group, you know, our understanding has developed. It's beyond nuts and bolts, and it's really true. We're past nuts and bolts. There's more going on here. And I personally believe that we're never really going to get all of it. It's probably just not in our destiny to get all of it, but to me, that's okay. And so where Klass was wrong is the value of this journey that we are on. I can only speak for myself personally. Going down this road, taking this off-ramp that was unexpected into this world of the UFO phenomenon has opened up more paradigm-opening doors than I could possibly have imagined. And so the journey, even if I don't get exactly where I want to get, this journey has been by far the most valuable detour of my life. And I've regretted not an instant for it. If I don't get every single answer I want, my feeling is that's okay. I've gained a great deal more simply by going down this road. And there's an old saying, you have to aim above the mark to hit the mark, you know? And that's really true of us. So we may not get every single thing that we want in understanding this, but if we get it 50%, well, that's better than 0%. So that's my attitude. I think this is an incredibly valuable subject to be studying. It's one of a few subjects that you can get into that you start prying it open and you realize, my God, there's so much deep complexity here. And this takes me back to a little bit of one of my slides, which I can't show you, unfortunately. Sorry. When I think about the complexity of this subject, so UFOs are interesting politically. That's my main area. I like to study the politics of the UFO cover-up, and it's a fascinating subject to get into politically. It opens up your understanding of what is the nature of the political system in our world. How can they keep a secret for, And that gets you in a lot of questions. But it's also interesting in terms of science. How are such things possible? How is it possible for an object to instantly accelerate noiselessly? I like to talk about this one case I found in the Canadian National Archives. I don't live far from Canada. I was in Ottawa a couple of years ago. And back in the 70s and 80s, Canadian citizens could, if they saw a UFO, could write to their government. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police would take the report and then send it off to Ottawa, where it would go into a circular file and no one would ever see it. But now those reports are all in the archives and you can read them. So one was written by an elderly gentleman from around 1980, 81. And he said, I'm just going to record this for posterity. There's really nothing to investigate now. But when I was 25 years old in 1936, he said, a long time ago, he said, I had a really neat job as a aerial mapping surveyor for the Canadian government. So think about 1936. It's the first time that they could really get up into the northern regions and do some serious mapping with aerial cameras. So for a 25-year-old kid, that's a cool job. He's flying out in the Northwest Territories with one of those pontoon planes that can land on the water, and he's taking photographs of these remote regions. So he said, I was at a place that is known as Aylmer Lake. I looked at it on Google Maps and gasped, it is so far remote. There's nothing there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. He said, and I was just doing a pre-flight check of my aircraft in a perfect blue sky, and I happened to look up and I saw the most perfect configuration of an airship one could imagine. Those are his exact words. He said it was slightly elongated. It was grayish, no reflection. He said it was facing in a north-south configuration. He said, I couldn't see any markings at it whatsoever. I couldn't tell how large it was because there was no clouds whatsoever. There was nothing, no reference point. He was a very meticulous writer, this man. He said it was just in a slightly elongated north-south configuration, and I watched it rotate to east-west and instantly accelerate without a sound to the horizon. It was gone in a matter of moments. Now, of course, all this is a report in the Canadian Archives. You could think, well, maybe he was just having some fun. I don't think so. He submitted his military records just to prove who he was, and which I didn't have access to. Those were removed from the archives, but he did submit them. So there you got this story. It's one of countless of these stories. And I choose to credit that one. And if that's the case, you're looking at 1936 in the Northwest Territories. What the heck was that, and what could do that at that period of time? So that's a scientific issue. There are all other, this is a fascinating story. There's all other aspects where the UFO phenomenon connects on the cutting edge of what we're thinking. There's the economics of UFOs. How is this funded covertly? How does this deal with what we call black budget economics? There's spiritual implications. How is it that so many people are having what they believe are telepathic communications with these other beings? And that happens. How is it that people feel that they're getting telepathic downloads from other entities? Now, for the record, I don't really know what I think about some of these claims, but I can say, and I'm sure many of you understand completely, that this is very widespread, and it's not the easiest thing for me just to dismiss it out of hand, and I won't dismiss it out of hand. There's something going on with this. And you start getting into this subject more and more. In addition to writing books, I published some books by some really good authors, and one is called The Messengers by a fellow named Mike Cleland, and he talks about UFOs and synchronicities, crazy synchronicities that just don't make sense. You come out of reading this book thinking our whole understanding of space and time is really not adequate to deal with what's actually happening. And it's a book that really messes with your whole idea of what is causality itself. So there's things, so the UFO subject takes us into all of these cutting edge areas of our understanding of reality. And what I would say is any subject that can lead us to the edge of so many important issues has got to be profound. It's got to be profound. And certainly worthy of much more than the standard ridicule that we get from our dumb mainstream culture. So, and that is a culture that keeps us penned in with what I call like a fence. It's a little fence. And that's our shared reality, our official reality that we're given. But beyond that fence is a world that is barred from us, for most of us. And I would say this is the world of the secrecy. People like to make fun of it sometimes. They think, oh, well, you're just into your tinfoil hat territory, but it's not true. Those of you who are here with military clearances, and I know there's a bunch of you here, you know that you encounter things that you are absolutely obligated not to talk about. And we do know now, we don't really have a total handle on how big is the secrecy in this country. We really don't. But there's some pretty good estimates of it. So there's a really interesting book printed a bunch of years ago called Blank Spots on the Map by a guy named Trevor Paglen, who talks about how roughly his estimate is that 50% of all U.S. government documents in one way or another are classified. So if that is so, that you could take that to mean that literally about half of all government activity in our country is classified, is secret. That's a pretty amazing thing to say. There's a tremendous amount of security and classification going on in our government that is withheld from us all the time. It's not an outrageous statement to make at all. And the deeper you delve into the UFO phenomenon, the more we realize that there's something happening. The only thing I'm going to say by way of introduction before I really dive in is this. If you're new to the subject of UFOs and you're wondering what is the big deal, I totally understand that. So what I would say to you is this. There are things that we know, and then there are things where it looks like certain, this is what we know and this is what it looks like, and those are two different things. So I can tell you what we know. What we know is that over the past 50 plus years, researchers have been able to acquire government-released documents, primarily through freedom of information, really starting in the mid-1970s, late 70s, when the Freedom of Information Act was strengthened enough to allow for this. Prior to the mid-70s, there were all kinds of researchers who suspected the government was lying about UFOs, but they couldn't really prove it sufficiently in terms of documents. By the late 70s, all that changed. And researchers started to petition the government for documents, and holy smokes, they started to get documents. Hundreds of pages, then thousands of pages. Now, most of these, if you read, they're ho-hum, not all that interesting, but some of them are very interesting. And if you take the top 50, top 100, you're going to have a pretty heck of a good case. And what individually, none of these documents will say, oh my God, boss, we're being invaded by extraterrestrials. So none of them say that. However, if you take those top documents, cumulatively, collectively, it is not a hint, not a suggestion, but it is proof that the UFO phenomenon was absolutely real in the sense of documenting violations of sensitive airspace by objects that didn't look normal, that is, they looked disc-shaped, didn't behave normally, that is, they had extraordinary capabilities and evasive maneuvers and things like this, and were matters of grave concern to higher-level national security. All of that is absolutely true. If I had to go on CNN and talk about UFOs, I could say that, and I'd be exactly 100% right, that there was something going on at the same time that the government was telling the people, nothing to see here, it's all hoaxes, hallucinations, misidentification, etc. So we know that that's all the case. So we know, in other words, that the government lied to us for years, decades, and generations about the seriousness of this subject. So that begs the question, well, who is behind the phenomenon? Was it the Russians? Is it us? And these were questions I just would point out to you that were actively asked by U.S. intelligence officials all through that period. And we know this because we got some of the conversations through released documentation. Now, we only have certain levels of classification. We don't have the highest levels. The higher up you go to top secret, the more blacked out the documents become. But we do have enough to say. We know this stuff was serious to a very intelligent, elite group of people responsible for national security. They took it seriously. Absolutely. So you start with that, and that leads to the question, what are we dealing with? Well, they asked, was it the Russians? And didn't seem to be the case, even though some people thought it might be, but there was we got no evidence. Even to this day, we don't. Next question, were we making them? That's an interesting question because, of course, after World War II, as probably everyone here knows by now, the U.S. acquired a bunch of really smart German scientists through what was called Project Paperclip. And some of those guys, by the way, were unrepentant Nazis, but we didn't care because they were really smart, and we put them to work. And some of them were involved in some very unusual aircraft designs and so forth. So the question is, did we make them? And there's an interesting argument that some researchers have put out that we were making them, but in my view, it's not strong enough to account for the whole phenomenon, and I think even many of them would agree with this, including Dr. Joseph Farrell, who's a friend of mine who's written a lot about this. And even Joe does not argue that they were all from Nazi tech anymore. So there's a lot going on. And so what we're finding within the U.S. intelligence community is that they were asking these questions actively, and there was always a large component of analysts who concluded this appears to be interplanetary or extraterrestrial. That the conclusion's never gone away. And we know that this serious line of speculation and conversation has always been going on in elite circles of national security. And I can just tell you personally, not that I'm that big a deal, but after my first book came out a number of years ago, I got my own little introduction to some of those people. And I'm no insider by any means, but what you find is that a lot of those folks will look out for researchers that they want to share little tidbits with. So every now and then I get scraps, from them, and I've always been impressed by the level of intelligence of these people, their knowledge of the subject, and again they keep telling me, yes, we take this very seriously. And so there's obviously something going on. So that's beyond the little circumscribed fence of our society, that there is a reality to this UFO phenomenon. All unacknowledged. One thing I want to say about space, just in purely conventional terms. The United States national security apparatus will never, and in their opinion, must never abdicate domination of space. It's the center of gravity, as it were, for the whole military program. You must dominate space as a platform if you're going to dominate the land. All of the smart bombs, all of the fancy weapons that the U.S. has, none of them would work if we didn't have an entire network of satellites in Earth orbit pinpointing all the targets. It's absolutely critical. And so from the military's point of view, they will never, ever abdicate domination of space as a theater of operations. We're moving into an interesting part of world history with the Russians and Chinese now, and other nations too, more and more actively moving into space. And how that's going to work out, I couldn't tell you any better than the next person. But the U.S. military, without a doubt, will always continue to attempt to dominate space. That means, by its very nature, having a secret space program. In other words, having secret satellites. And of course, the whole nature of arms race in space is that other nations or adversaries will look at U.S. satellites and think, well, that's a problem militarily, so they develop anti-satellite weapons. And it's just like the development of aircraft 100 years ago. In World War I, we had primitive aircraft that would be, their first job was to fly over enemy territory and draw the disposition of the troops. And then the enemy started trying to shoot those guys down, and you'd had fighter planes, and you had, and then they tried dropping bombs, and the whole thing escalated. It's the same thing now with space. So you get satellites up there, and it all becomes weaponized, and it's an inevitability, in my view, in terms of the world geopolitics. So that's never going to stop. So the only question that we really want to ask is not, is there a secret space program? That's a given. The only question we are really asking is, how advanced is it? How far beyond our ordinary technology is it? And I will tell this story. I've told it a few other times. I was lucky to meet I probably shouldn't jump right into remote viewing. This is getting into some craziness, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. So remote viewing, some people think it's silly, but I don't. Remote viewing is simply the official U.S. intelligence community program to have psychic spies. And if you don't think it's true, well, look into it. It happened. It was real. It is real. I was friendly with probably the most famous remote viewer in the world, a man named Ingo Swann. Ingo lived in New York City for a while, and I spent the night in his home once. We got to chat. Ingo did some of the original work for the CIA and Stanford Research Institute on remote viewing in the early 70s, and did some amazing work. So basically seeing things that you're not supposed to be able to see, and on and on and on. And he was great at it. Ingo, by the mid-70s, was so well known within the classified world. He got phone calls from all kinds of places, and they wanted him to do work for them. He had remote viewed Jupiter, by the way, before our first satellite arrived there. And he got 12 or 13 data points about Jupiter, none of which were known. All but one have been proven true, including the existence of a planetary ring, which before our first satellite reached Jupiter, no one knew that Jupiter had a ring. Ingo saw it, and it was true. Carl Sagan said, lucky guess. But I don't think so. He did. So anyway, Ingo within the classified world was this made him like a celebrity, right? He gets a phone call at one point from a very mysterious person, and he agrees to be in Washington the next day at the Smithsonian Institute in front of the big elephant there, and they were going to pay him a lot of money to do some work. These two mysterious-looking, military-looking twins don't say a word. They come up to him. They check his wrist to see his tattoo to know that it's him. They knew about this, apparently. They talk to him with cue cards. Hello, Mr. Swan. We're here to take you, blah, blah, blah. They don't say a word. They get into the back of a car. There's a woman driving. They give him a cue card saying, we're sorry to do this, but we really can't let you see where we're taking you. We have to blindfold you. He wasn't happy about that, but he did it. They drive. They get out of the car, they get into a helicopter, they go a certain distance, they get out of the helicopter, into a building, into an elevator, down, 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 down. Door opens, and a mysterious man named Mr. Axelrod greets Ingo and says, hello, Ingo. We'd like you to do some work. We're going to pay you very handsomely for the week. The first thing Axelrod asks Ingo Swann is, Ingo, what do you know about the moon? And Ingo Swann said, well, I know it's there. That's about it. And Axelrod has Ingo Swann, among other things for this week, remote view various coordinates on the moon. I chatted with Ingo about this personally. I was very lucky to be able to do it. And I also talked with Ingo's supervisor, Dr. Harold Puthoff, who I know somewhat well. And Hal Puthoff said to me, and I believe this, he said, look, I cannot vouch for the accuracy of what Ingo remote viewed, of course, but I can tell you if Ingo said something happened, you can take that to the bank. He was absolutely trustworthy, honest, and that was my experience with Ingo Swann. Anyway, so Ingo remote views 6 coordinates on the moon, including seeing beings and machinery and structures. This is in the 70s. And then at one point he says, Axelrod, they're looking at me, and Axelrod says, come away from there very quickly. That's the Ingo Swann story. There's a conversation that I had with Russell Targ, who was the other, along with Hal Puthoff, the co-creator of creating the protocols for the remote viewers in the 70s. I talked with Russell 10 years ago or so on the phone, and he said to me, Richard, in the early 1980s, I was charged with training remote viewers at Fort Meade, Maryland, whose job was to remote view the far side of the moon. And I've told this story once a couple of times. And I just said, well, something, remote viewing the far side of the moon, I think I can figure out where we're going here. I said, well, Russell, why would they do that? And he didn't want to be the one to bring it up. He said, well, why do you think? And I thought, I'll bite. Okay. Well, were they going to look for E.T. on the far side of the moon? He said, yes, they were. He didn't say no. He didn't say maybe. He said, yes, their job was going to be to look for extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon in the early 1980s. I said, well, did they find extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon? He said, well, that I don't know. That wasn't part of my assignment. Now, whether he knows or not, I don't know. But I believe this story. So we've got some interesting little things going on here about the moon. There's the story of former Sergeant Carl Wolf. He's very well known. He spoke years ago for Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project in 2001. Carl Wolf has spoken a few times, a number of times, very consistently about his experience in 1965 working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in intelligence, and he was assigned to do some work at the NSA, which he thought was NASA, back in the mid-'60s. People didn't know what the NSA was. Stands for No Such Agency, right? And he said, look, I was talking with another airman, and he was showing me satellite images from the moon images, some of the earliest digital images that we were developing at the time, which showed what certainly to him appeared to be structures on the far side of the moon. And he said many times, I got very frightened by this. I felt that I was not cleared to know this information, and I didn't talk about it for 35 years. But then he started talking about it. There has been criticism of his story, which is that, officially speaking, our first images of the far side of the moon supposedly didn't come back till 1967. So maybe there's a problem in chronology, or maybe it is that he actually had access to images before they were officially brought back. I don't know the answer to this. I do think Wolf seems to be very legitimate. There's a lady named Donna Hare, who I think is a very, very convincing whistleblower. From the early 70s, she was worked for a company called Philco Ford, which did contract work for NASA. So in the early 70s, she was very involved in the Apollo program. She did a number of interviews in the 90s and beyond where she said, look, first of all, you have the scuttlebutt. There was constant talk, even among the astronauts, about being followed by UFOs on every single mission, without exception. So she said that. She says, secondly, I was dating a guy at that time, and his job was to accompany the astronauts from the moon into quarantine. And this guy heard all the chat from the astronauts, and also confirmed UFOs following them on every single mission, including on the moon. So this is the famous rumor that many of you have probably heard as well, that when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, Neil and Buzz saw large craft there. The British researcher Timothy Good has talked about this as well years ago in his book Above Top Secret, about having a source who was present at a function where Neil Armstrong was, and this source of his overheard a conversation supposedly that Armstrong had with another individual who was asking him what everyone would want to ask: what really happened on the moon? And this source is a woman, a friend of Tim Good's, turns out, overheard what she was adamant was the following conversation. Armstrong basically saying, oh my God, those things were huge, they were menacing, and we knew to stay away, and we just had to do our mission and get the heck out of there. I did talk to Timothy Good about this lady privately. She is since deceased, unfortunately. But, Tim has said to me, look, she was rock solid, so that's what you have to go on. The stories about the UFOs following Apollo missions are endemic. A man named Maurice Chatelain, another NASA engineer back in the late 60s, early 70s. There's a number of patents to his name. He's a very impressive man. Has also talked explicitly about UFOs following our guys to the moon. So, and then I just met a month and a half ago at the MUFON Symposium in Las Vegas a man named Ken Johnston, who is another well-placed NASA mission control specialist from the late 60s, early 70s, who said the exact same thing. That is, particularly with Apollo 11, on their way to the moon, describing being or encountering or seeing UFOs and switching to secure classified channels to continue communications with Houston. So you've got these people continually filtering through, telling really the same story, which is that during the Apollo missions, they were encountering what we would call UFOs. So all of these are kind of a backdrop to a secret space program. I have argued for a number of years that we do have a secret space program. And so that's part of the evidence that I would submit to you, is just the fact that, look, if you're going out into space and this UFO phenomenon isn't just in Earth orbit, but it's out there, clearly our intelligence community is going to need to have a secret program to deal with that. If they don't want us to know about UFOs on the ground, they're certainly not going to want us to know about UFOs out in space. So there will be a clandestine element to their program to deal with that, right? Of course, it makes sense. On top of that, we're led into what I sometimes call the land of leaks. But in my view, not all leaks are of the same value. But there are some very valuable leaks indeed. Let me talk first about the whole crash retrieval phenomenon. We'll talk a little bit about that. So we've all heard about the Roswell crash of 1947, where the U.S. Army apparently recovered a flying saucer that was not from here. I'm one of the people who believe that that's the case. I think the Roswell story is a strong one. It's not the same level of proof as getting government documents, like through Freedom of Information, but it's also not a bad level of knowledge when you look at all of the sources that we have. And the Roswell case is only one of a number of good crash retrieval stories, believe it or not. In fact, a very good one was even 6 years before Roswell, Cape Girardeau in Missouri. It's not as strong a case in terms of evidence, but it's pretty strong, and there are witnesses, and it's not a bad case. There's the Aztec, New Mexico case from 1948, which I am absolutely convinced was a genuine article. Some very good research done on that in the last decade that has really reopened that case up, and a number of others. Quite a few other probable crash retrieval cases. Why are there so many flying saucers that crash? I really couldn't tell you. Are we trying to take them down? Is it a clandestine war? Maybe. That's totally possible. I don't have every answer to this, and I wouldn't pretend to. But I would say there was a researcher about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, named Leonard Stringfield. Some of you know this name, who really pioneered this subject and just became a magnet for inside sources about this subject. So people would come to him and say, well, I once did a security detail at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where I saw a variety of alien bodies. I wasn't supposed to see them, but they were sure as heck there. Or sometimes it would be the spouse of a deceased person who would tell, what usually her husband, but sometimes it was reversed. Sometimes it was a husband telling about what his wife had known in her classified world. Dealing with crash retrievals, dealing with alien bodies. One of Stringfield's guys was a New York City doctor who had talked with him at length about autopsies he had done on extraterrestrial beings, and Stringfield really cultivated this guy for a while. Stringfield collected dozens, scores of these stories, and he couldn't confirm them all. He did his best, but it did provide a very consistent pattern. And the pattern was that this phenomenon is going on, and we are acquiring their hardware and technology and trying to develop their science. That was the pattern. And I believe that that is exactly what's happened. So when we're dealing with this phenomenon, it's not simply a case where these objects are flying around and we can't contain them. That's a problem enough. But the other part of the problem is we've acquired some of their stuff, and we're actively working on replicating it to the best of our ability. And to do that, of course, that requires a whole heavy cloak of secrecy, because think about it. You go back to the 1940s, and let's say Roswell did happen. I think it did. So pretend that it did. And you're the president, and you're the one responsible for dealing with this information. Do you tell the world? It's a really good question to ask. Do you tell the world? You might want to, until all your advisors say, not a good idea. Because in 1947, of course, the U.S., if you remember your history, had a monopoly of atomic bombs. And it was a very big issue at the time as to whether the U.S. should allow the United Nations to have control over nuclear technology. Because the argument was that this is too important for any one nation to have. It's something that the world has to guard. And America's answer was, no thanks, we're going to keep this to ourselves. That's the quickest way to give this to the Soviets. We're not going to do that. So there was a whole atomic espionage going on, of course, and all of this. So the point is the U.S. wasn't willing to share atomic technology. Do we really think they're going to share something as exotic as extraterrestrial technology? Clearly not. And clearly they didn't. And what all the signs look like is that this subject was considered way too disruptive, way too important. One thing that I've always concluded is maybe the most important element of the secrecy has to do with energy, or at least it's one of them, because after all, even anyone noticing an object that can instantly, silently accelerate is going to realize they're probably not using gasoline to go from here to there. They're probably using something better. Whatever that better is, there's a lot of candidates, but it almost doesn't matter because all of them would be revolutionary in our world. I mean, we're in a petroleum-based world. Every single thing that the United States does internationally is based on dominance of petroleum. It's called the petrodollar system. That's a whole other lecture. So if we have an acknowledgement that the UFO phenomenon's real and that we got some of their technology, how long do you think it would be before people realize, oh wow, what's the source of energy? That would be really cool for us to have. Free energy. We could get our own flying saucer and zip off to another country. Well, that's really cool for us. Might not be an easy problem for the political hierarchy. You know, and I don't want to make things in terms of a black and white, like, oh, they're evil and we're good, but it is a serious issue when you give the people access to revolutionary energy from the point of view of political control. That's a real problem, because suddenly you have free energy. You can say to your utility company, up yours, and I'm going to go off the grid forever and I don't need you. So now you've got a level of independence and sovereignty that is also problematic. On top of the fact that petroleum corporations, who basically help run the world, are not going to make the profits that they've been making. So there's all of these repercussions. It's disruptive. That's the real problem. So there'd be a lot of motivations for keeping this whole thing quiet. And the other, maybe even more serious thing would be weaponization of this technology. You know, we like to think that we're all nice people, but let's face it, we're not all nice people. In fact, none of us are really nice people when you really give us a chance. And if you give people, we have to be honest here. We've all got the darkness to the soul. We all do. This is why people do bad things. And it's, people who do bad things are not always inherently different from us. They have a different situation. My point is simply that if you give us all radical technology, all right, that technology can not only heat your home forever for life, but it can also maybe be used to create a really big weapon. And maybe you could trust yourself, but could you trust every one of your neighbors? Maybe not. I don't think I could. I know my neighbors. So the point is that there would be genuine reasons, at least from the point of view of those people with the secret, to keep it quiet, and the secrecy begins. But that wouldn't stop them from trying to deal with these others. And so you have a clandestine Earth-based program, and you have a clandestine space program to deal with this. So back to the space program. My phone just went black here. Here we go. There are a number of these other stories. One other that I will share with you. This is another story that came to me directly from a retired CIA man. I don't know a lot of CIA people. I've occasionally been accused of being working for the Illuminati and Cabal, and I think that's amusing. If so, I'm asking, where's my paycheck? I don't have one. And I also don't like those guys, so I don't really see why I could possibly work for them. Anyway, I did meet with this, I talked at length, I should say, with this one man who was retired CIA, a very brilliant man who used to give briefings to Ronald Reagan. Knows very, very much about the UFO phenomenon. And told me a story that he got, and he's very meticulous the way he tells his stories. It's very precise. He said, this did not come from me directly, but I have a colleague who was in the first 2 years of the Jimmy Carter presidency who was there when this happened. And Jimmy Carter, he said, in June of 1977, his first year as president, received a UFO briefing, ET-related briefing. Now, this man's colleague was not in the room when Carter received the briefing, but he was there when the door opened and he saw Jimmy Carter at the conclusion of the briefing, elbows on his desk, head in his hands, and either sobbing or seeming to be sobbing. He was deeply upset. And he knows that it was a UFO-related meeting. He doesn't know what was said to the president. You can use your own speculation. Was he told, yeah, this is really serious, sir, we have no control over it? Well, that's one possibility. Was it, we've got this under control and you have no authority over it? That's another possibility. There's a lot to wonder about here. One other story that I will give you, when I wrote the book AD After Disclosure, my co-author and I combined a number of the stories that we'd collected. One of them, another was from the first Reagan administration. And there was a young man at the time, he was 19 years old, a friend of the family of someone who became an undersecretary for Ronald Reagan in 1981. So there's a 19-year-old man, and they visited the family shortly after the inauguration. And the undersecretary and this young guy they were like almost like a father and son type of relationship. And it's 2 in the morning, and the old guy's had a couple of drinks, and he's unwinding, and it's 2 in the morning, and he starts talking about how after he took his job, he was taken to an underground facility for several weeks, briefed on the extraterrestrial phenomenon. And it upset him deeply, and the main thing that he said was that I'm concerned because I have a daughter in this world that I have to bring up. And that's all he would say. So we've got these hints that there's something going on. So let me talk a little bit about, I mentioned the crash retrieval phenomenon, that we've recovered things. Going further into the land of leaks, there was an aerospace journalist from the 1980s and 90s named James Goodall. He was not a UFO guy. He was an aerospace aviation guy. He cultivated a lot of people at Area 51 in the Groom Lake area in Nevada. Very secret. And in the mid-'80s, this is before Bob Lazar came out, and no one really knew what Area 51 was back then. Goodall was interviewing some of these people. He interviewed one guy with 11 years experience at Groom, asking about UFOs, because that was always coming up when you talk about Groom Lake. And he said, do you believe in UFOs? And the guy says, absolutely, positively, they exist. Would you expand on that? No. But he did get him to expand later. And the guy said, listen, we have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious. Exact words. And then he went on and said, better than Star Wars, better than Star Trek, or anything you see in the movies. This is in 1985 or so. You can say, well, it's just a story. True. Then there's another story, and this one I really love, from 1988. It's the ARV story, and I'm going to give it very quickly. ARV stands for Alien Reproduction Vehicle. In November of 1988, right after George Bush won the election against Michael Dukakis, there was an air show out in California. A colleague and friend of mine, he's now a friend of mine, named Mark McCandlish, an aviation illustrator, superb illustrator, was going to go to this air show with his friend who was an aviation executive named Brad Sorensen. At the last minute, McCandlish couldn't go. He had some deadline he had to meet. And Sorensen goes with a friend of his family, a top-level U.S. defense official who is nameless to this day. The official says, I got a real air show for you. And they take a separate flight to another base at Lockheed and go to a place called the Big Hangar. And inside, on one side of the hangar, are really cool aircraft that lost bids for military contracts, but that were really experimental and interesting anyway. And on the other side of the hangar, Sorensen looked, and he saw what he described as 3 flying saucers, small, medium, and large. He said he looked down. They were hovering, he said, silently. He looked for ropes, things holding them, cables, nothing, he said. At that point, he said he became hyper alert and looked at every single thing. Described it in such detail that McCandlish drew a very detailed illustration of it, which is online. You can find it. There was a 4-star general at a podium, just like this one, talking about these as ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles. That is, our attempts to reproduce alien technology in 1988, almost 30 years ago. Describing them as having traversed the solar system at that point. At that point. Sorensen looked at these and he says they looked like they'd been beat to hell. They were dented and knocked around. It was like, wow, that's like an old car that had just been run 150,000 miles. They had that kind of look, in his opinion. He said there was a video display of craft that looked identical to these, maybe it was, maybe not, at a dry desert lake, instantly lifting off and taking off. So that's what he said he saw. So again, you can say, well, I choose not to believe it, or I choose to believe it. I do know that a number of individuals, high-level people did privately interview Sorensen, and to my knowledge, everyone has come away totally convinced that he was legitimate. He certainly does not want attention. It only came out because he told his friend McCandlish, and it got out again through the I think through the Stephen Greer Disclosure Project of about 16, 17 years ago. So there are these things that are going on. Let me just scroll through my notes here. I'm looking at the time. So the other thing that I guess I will add to give you my opinion that we are dealing with the secret space program are two other forms of evidence that are significant. I do wish I had the video for this one. I wanted to show you. There's some very good, you can find this on YouTube, however, of space-based UFOs. I mean, this is easy to find. And I'm not saying every YouTube video you find on UFOs is legit, right? And just as an aside, I'll point out we're in a different place in our society now than we were 60 years ago. 60 years ago, thereabouts, the big problem that people like us had was in getting access to good UFO reports. That was a real problem. You know, collecting them. There was no internet, and it was not easy. Today, our problem is the opposite. Now we are flooded with reports, and we don't really know how to make sense of them. Chuck of Seco Saucers, when he was talking here just a little while ago, was very correct to point out that there are two major websites today if you have a UFO sighting where you could go. You can go to the MUFON website, which will take it, or you can go to the National UFO Reporting Center. Just so that you know, those two websites combined every single year have roughly 15,000 raw reports that they get from US and Canada alone. And I can tell you there's almost no overlap between those websites. And I know this because, A, I've tried to find it and there isn't, but there is a good researcher in New York State, Cheryl Costa, who's looked into this in great detail and has concluded it's maybe a 1% overlap. So there's about 15,000 UFO sightings that those two sites alone receive. Now, of course, look, they're not all alien craft. I mean, probably the vast majority are not anything other than conventional, but let's say even 1% are really anomalous. And if you go through the reports, by the way, more than 1% are really interesting. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. And but back to the YouTube videos, you can go online and you can find some fascinating space-based video that is captured by NASA, by the European Space Agency, and so on. One man who's no longer with us, named Jeffrey Challender, with a D. He lived in Sacramento for years. Jeff, I met him once, and I loved his website. I love his work. He had severe disabilities and was basically homebound, and he spent all of his time getting live NASA feeds of space missions and downloading it and analyzing it. And he found a ton of stuff. He was a very analytical guy. He didn't just believe every single thing. One of the things that he found, and it's now you can find it on YouTube, is from 2005, not that long ago, an object in Earth orbit doing a U-turn. The video, if you find it, it's sped up so that, because in reality it took, I think, 3 or 4 minutes. So the video that you're seeing is much sped up, but you absolutely see a U-turn. I can't see any way that this is an illusion, an optical effect in any way whatsoever. And there's a number of other very bizarre anomalies of objects doing angled turns, and some of them could be explained by rocket boosters and the motion of the satellite and so on, but I don't think all of them. I really don't believe so, and when you go into the details, it's very difficult. So there's something unusual going on in Earth orbit. That's one form of evidence, and then you've got a number of people now increasingly with night vision, binoculars. I've had the opportunity a few times to look through night vision, and there is absolutely no question, zero question. You put night vision on, and you look up at the sky at night, and you're going to see a lot of things that you had no idea are up there with good quality night vision. The first time I did it was back in 2008. I was in southwestern Illinois at a little town called Galena, Illinois. Ulysses S. Grant was from Galena. Beautiful night. You look up, and I felt like I was in Grand Central Station at like midnight, 1 in the morning. You're not supposed to see a lot of air traffic at that hour. And in 2 hours, I saw about 100 things zooming across the sky. And they weren't insects. They were not. Some were very high-flying satellites that were zooming across like super fast. I couldn't really explain these things. So there's an infrastructure that's out there. And I don't know that they all have flying saucer technology, but there's absolutely a classified infrastructure. It's advanced, and it's out there. And as a society, I say we need to be having a much more open discussion about it. So, and some of them include triangles, by the way. And someone is manufacturing big black triangles. I've only recently started talking. I chatted with a retired Boeing engineer. There's, of course, long-standing stories about Boeing manufacturing black triangles. I talked to a retired Boeing engineer and his wife, both wonderful people, who talked to me about his time at Boeing in the 80s and 90s and his knowledge that Boeing was, he said to me, reverse engineering ET tech to create these triangles, and that they had not fully mastered the technology, by the way. And said a couple of other really out there things to me, like that they would jump. And I said, what do you mean they jump? He says, I don't really know myself. They'd be here, and then they'd not be here. And his strongly held opinion is that we, at least when he was there, and he left at the late 90s, he didn't think that they'd fully mastered the technology. Really makes you think, like, I'm rewatching for the first time in years Steven Spielberg's Taken. Remember that miniseries? It's pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of fictionalized elements to it. But there was that one moment where, you know, they're trying to figure out how to fly the flying saucer through mental powers. And it just made me think, you know, maybe we're trying to figure this out. The last thing I'll just say before I get into some of the current claims about secret space, I'm friendly with another colleague, a lady who's really expert, I would say, in drone technology. She's done FOIA requests on, gotten hundreds of U.S. Pentagon documents on drones. And I don't know too many of the people who's really digging into this the way she is. She's become obsessed with drones because she has night vision herself, and she sees them, she believes. She says, these are military, they're not ET. They are, she said, I'm going to read, I have the quote here. I wish I had this on the screen, but I'll just read it. She says, there are all kind of craft up there, military research development drones, drone triangles, and even a huge rectangular craft in daylight that she saw. I just lost my place here. Beg your pardon. Here we go. She says, I have seen these craft cloak. I saw one cloak over my house at treetop level. I can tell you it could not be seen at all. And I was about 50 yards away. I've also seen these drones from less than 30 feet. That's like inside this room easily. And there is no movement, no vibration, nothing. They look as though they are glued to the sky, she said. Again, it's her assessment that most of these are actually military, and they're just very advanced. So we've got this infrastructure. So let me jump to some of the other claims. Now, years ago in one of my books, I developed an idea which is called the breakaway civilization. I've always considered it a hypothesis. I think it's a true hypothesis, but still a hypothesis. And the idea is, you think about the black budget world. Let's say we are in the classified world and we have access to alien tech and we're studying it, and we all have genius level IQs and we're figuring this out, and we come up with some pretty cool ideas, right? Some of those ideas might be really good money makers. You know, maybe high-tech, high tensile fibers or lasers or fiber optics, maybe, right? And we can all make some good money on those when they get segued into industry. So that's a nice goose that lays golden eggs. But let's say we come up with breakthroughs that are even better than that. Breakthroughs in propulsion, breakthroughs in energy generation, breakthroughs that our bosses say, not so fast. That's a little too disruptive for the world. We will continue to develop it, but we're just going to keep that classified. There are thousands and thousands of classified patents that we know about, and many of them, I think most of them, may be related to energy. And I only know this because there's another researcher who was in the patent office at the U.S. Named Thomas Vallone, and that was his assessment. A lot of classified energy patents. So we would continue to develop propulsion and energy on our own, withholding it from the world. And that would allow us to have certain capabilities that the rest of the world doesn't have, like, build our own flying saucers and maybe going off-world, developing electrogravitic propulsion techniques and so on. And if we actually can go off-world, like in the legendary ARV that I talked about earlier, we would have interactions with that reality that the rest of the world wouldn't have. We would develop a worldview that no one else would have. We would develop, in a sense, our own separate civilization, one that's broken away from the mainstream and is racing ahead, beyond. Computing technology is one area that I've often wondered about. Again, one conversation I had with a scientist who worked at the NSA in the mid-'60s said to me that the NSA back then had computers running at a clock speed of 650 megahertz. Now, today, that's no great shakes. Your smartphone's better than that. But the consumer market, first of all, there were no computers in the consumer market in 1965. But secondly, the consumer market didn't reach that clock speed until around the year 2000, or 35 years later. So you could say, here is a secret agency, the NSA, which had maybe the fastest computers in the world, 35 years ahead of regular people. Interesting to say that. So where would our hypothetical classified world be if we had alien tech tossed into the mix and we had total secrecy and an infinite amount of money to play with to research this? Well, we could probably go pretty far. And we could probably create a clandestine space program totally off the grid, off the record, and deal in whatever way we felt we needed to with the presence of these other beings that are certainly here. Artificial intelligence is a whole new dimension to this, and I'm personally fascinated by AI. I've been into it for almost as long as I've studied UFOs, maybe longer, actually. And I read my first book on AI around 1990. Fascinating. I have believed for a long time that very likely what we're dealing with in terms of UFOs is probably a product of some strong AI. And where the black budget world is, the breakaway civilization is in terms of AI, I couldn't tell you. I can only assume that they're doing very, very, very well with it. And then there's other developments like quantum computing and something I recently learned about called molecular computing, and that's a whole other ball of wax. Nanotech, and of course genetic engineering and what we now call CRISPR technology, gene editing. You really have to wonder where these guys are with all of that. And no one really knows. There's a historian of the NSA called James Bamford. I like his work a lot. He was asked a couple of years ago where he thought the NSA was in terms of quantum computing, and he said, I'd say 50-50, that they have it or not. So Bamford didn't know, as far as I could tell. So there's a lot of mystery that's out there. But I think we want to assume that there's a great deal of advances that they have. So if you see what looks like a UFO, we really are going to have a hard time knowing ours or theirs. And this has been the question that's gone on for a long, long time, and it's actually more difficult now, in my opinion, than it's ever been. And not simply because of our own advanced technology, but just simple off-the-shelf drone technology makes it more and more difficult for people to really know what we're dealing with. But that's a whole other question. What I would say is that there's definitely a phenomenon. It's happening. We have a classified infrastructure that's working to deal with it, and part of that infrastructure is in space. So now let me deal in the last few minutes with the whistleblowers that are recently out there. And I'll mention names now because it's been out there. I've done tons of interviews. I was on a panel at MUFON just a month and a half ago, sitting with them on a panel. And so some of you are familiar with the name of Corey Goode, William Tompkins, who is 94 years old and just passed away in August, Andrew Basiago, and then the researcher Michael Salla, who writes and supports most of them. And then myself at the MUFON panel. And this is just a funny story. So I had been, what I like to say, unofficially banned from MUFON for 6 years after I spoke up with my big mouth about certain needs for MUFON to reform in 2011, and that didn't go over well. And I had to say what I wanted to say, and I was polite about it. So anyway, I hadn't gone to a MUFON symposium after that for 6 years. I had been a regular before then. So I get invited back for 2017. Jan Harzan, the director, we're friends. He called me early this year, like January, I think, and asked if I would speak, and I said I would. And then he asked me explicitly if I would speak about the secret space program. Now, this is something I've done in the past, but I really wasn't in the mood to do it, but he asked adamantly, and I said I would do it. I would come up with new ideas about this. Months later, many months later, because I forgot all about it, I learned, oh, I'm on the panel with Corey Goode and William Tompkins and Andrew Basiago and Michael Salla, and I had serious reservations with everything that they had to say. And I elected to continue to do the panel, and I'm glad that I did. It's on YouTube. So their story is as follows. So Andrew, who's a very likable guy personally, I talked with Andy, and has said for the last decade or so that he's gone to Mars through what he calls the jump room. He was brought as a child into what he calls Project Pegasus, and in fact, in the early 1980s, jumped to Mars with a young Barack Obama. And by the way, Barack Obama, Andrew Basiago, and me are almost all the same age. They're almost exactly, and I'm half a year younger than those guys, so we're all kind of in the same little club in terms of age. Anyway, so Andy said, I did this with him. We went to Mars. I go, okay. And then he said, and I will just say, I don't believe that, okay. And then he said other things about time traveling as a child back to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 1963, when Abraham Lincoln, who stood right here, I think. I have a perennial man crush on Lincoln. I do, I really do. Like, he's my favorite historical figure. I'm fascinated by him. Anyway, where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, and Andy said, I was there. There's a picture of me right there. And my attitude is, sorry, but I don't believe that either. And, you know, I just don't. So that's Andy, and he has more to say. And he's very intelligent. He has a lot of very technical details that he can lay out about this, but I just don't believe the story. Corey Goode, ditto, I have to say. Corey Goode's become much more prominent than Andy in the last few years. Talks about the Blue Avians and the Sphere Alliance, and his travels to Mars, the 20 and Back program. And my complaint about this is not whether I believe it or not. Because, look, I actually do believe in some pretty far out things, as I think I've just given you the idea. And I do think that there's some very radical technologies that are being withheld from us. So that's not my problem. My problem is this, and I've said this at MUFON, I'll say it here. It comes down to the quality of evidence. So as a UFO researcher, for example, I know full well that when I'm speaking to you or to the rest of the world, I have a certain obligation. And my obligation is to provide as much factual data for you as I can so that you can examine it. And then you have the opportunity to accept it or reject it, but that's your choice, right? And you can certainly reject it, but it's my obligation to provide evidence. If I'm just giving you a whole lot of stories that you can't check, and by the way, today I have given you a couple of stories that you really can't check, and that wasn't a little fair of me, but I try to give you other information that you can confirm. But if I did this all the time and gave you unconfirmable stories, then I'm not really playing fair, in my opinion. And also implicitly, researchers who do this, in my view, put themselves above the rest of us. And they're basically saying, I have special information, and I'm dispensing it to you. And no, you really can't check my information. You just have to trust me. And when I hear that, I think that's not cool, and I don't support that. I don't think that's a good way to go about this phenomenon. And so that's my opinion, that's my position, rather, on these people with the secret space program. And not only that, it's impossible to verify the stories. They are, by their nature, impossible to verify or to prove true or false. But the very backgrounds of these alleged whistleblowers, and I'm talking about Andrew and Corey Goode in particular, is also impossible to, there's nothing to bite into here. So I'm left with a whole lot of nothing. And so and then on top of that, of course, we have to keep in mind the UFO field has in fact been littered with disinformation right out of the gate. And this is also verifiable. The organization NICAP, starting in the 1950s, organized by, ran for years anyway, by retired Marine Corps Major Donald Kehoe, had a lot of ex-CIA, naval intelligence. Most of them seemed like they might have been on the level, but there were definitely former CIA people who were very much involved in subverting that organization by the 1960s, and that's been well documented. MUFON is another one, dominated by intelligence operatives for many, many years. You just have to wonder what is actually happening here, particularly when an organization for decade after decade is doing nothing more than just spinning its wheels, as far as anyone can tell. You got to wonder. On top of that, we have known cases of genuine disinformation entering the field. We're talking the infamous Richard C. Doty back in the early 1980s, feeding information, seeming to feed information relating to the deep aspects of the cover-up that led into dead ends. And it just goes on and on. So we have to be on our guard. If I were in charge of managing the UFO secret, I would absolutely make sure that I littered the field with as much unprovable disinfo as possible. And if I had to manage a secret space program, I would surely bring in people to say outlandish things that could not be verified, that would lead researchers into dead ends, and also make the field look ridiculous to outsiders in the process, which all of that mission accomplished. So I don't know the motivations of these whistleblowers. Some of them seem very sincere. Some of them maybe don't. Some of them, and I'm not mentioning names here at all, but I've felt seem mentally unbalanced. And I'm just going to put this out there because I think it's true. And by the way, look, I'm not here to malign mental illness. I have friends who have mental illness. I'm sure all of you do too. We all know people who have issues, and it's not a stigma. It's a thing. It's real. But when you've got someone who's got deep psychological issues that are putting themselves out there in giving what they feel is a revealed truth, we are obligated to look at that critically, you know. And so that's my take on the Mars program. I will say this though, on behalf of Mars, another of my unconfirmable rumors, I hope to out these people at one point or another. Early on in my research in this field, I was familiar with the claims of anomalies on Mars, you know. And that's an interesting thing. And I was communicating with one scientist. This is the same scientist who once told me about how he feels the black budget works, and it was very interesting. So I asked him about, intentionally I made a disparaging remark about the Mars phenomenon. And he wrote back to me, he says, you shouldn't make fun of that, because there's a lot of us in our world who look at that stuff very seriously and are very concerned about those anomalies. And that's all he would say to me. And I thought, aha, okay, there is something going on there. At least I think that's true. So there's definitely a reality, in my view, to the fact that we've got this classified infrastructure. And the problem that we as citizens face, it seems to me, is that, you know, I mean, here I'm standing on the stage that Abraham Lincoln spoke at in March of 1860. And you think of Lincoln, you think of that great phrase, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that is what the American system is always supposed to be about. We are supposed to be the sovereign entities, you and I. And when we have a government that by degrees over the past human lifetime or more has become so opaque, so non-transparent, that surveils every single thing that we do, that intimidates us by having us monitored at every single traffic stop practically, and you know, getting our license plate and monitoring your Facebook and your emails and everything else, monitoring your social media, and they do. Most people don't care. right? Most people don't stick their head up. They're down like this in their life. But if you stick your head up, you better watch out because someone's going to whack you. And that's an act of intimidation, because every free society demands dissent. Every free society demands disagreement. And so when we're in a situation where we cannot gain access to what appears to be the single most important socio-economic political development of our time, which is this massive, what appears to be, highly sophisticated infrastructure that's out there and probably down here too, then that's a problem for us. That's a real problem for us. And increasingly what my fear is that, it's now been, 16 years since 9/11. The anniversary's coming up. And 27% of all Americans are the age of, I think, 21 and younger. So more than a quarter. So these are people who grew up in a post-9/11 world. Even if you're 5 years old when it happened, I mean, you were too young really to understand what was happening. So all of, more than a quarter now of the population really have no memory of the before times, as I sometimes call them. The time when Americans actively believed and took for granted that they had certain rights and, dare I say, obligations as free citizens to act in a certain way and to know that they had those freedoms. And privacy. That's all going away, and we're seeing it go away. And the entire new generation now grows up not only not caring that they've lost privacy, but actively giving it up and giving themselves up on social media. It's disturbing to me. And I speak as a father of two. I have a 21 and a 19-year-old. And fortunately, they're not too bad about it. But I see it everywhere. There are future legislators, future leaders, future thought leaders, and all of that, and that's right. So my point is simply this, and I'm getting toward the end here, and I do want to open up for a couple of questions. For us to get to the bottom of this great unknown, it's not simply that there's a secret space program. It's what is the reason for that secret space program, and the reason for that is, I think, in large part to deal with the presence of others that are here. So I look at this subject as probably the single most revolutionary subject that I can imagine. I can't think of anything of more profound revolutionary implications than this. If we were to rip the veil off of this, how much would come out? And, I wrote a book about it. It was called After Disclosure, and I think even that book only scratched the barest surface of the mess that would probably come out as a result of the end of secrecy. We're dealing, with a lot of difficulties here, and the only thing I would say is it's okay that maybe we are outmatched at times by this reality. That doesn't really bother me. Human beings, we're outmatched by everything. We've always been, and we just keep going. And maybe that's the name of the game. That's the nature of what we're about. But I firmly believe, if I have a faith in anything, I do have a faith in this little elusive thing called the truth, and in our ability, if we're ever going to go to where we're supposed to go as a species, as a civilization, then I have to say we are never going to get there without total access to the truth on this matter. We have to grasp it and confront it and deal with it and grow up to the next phase of wherever it is we're going to be. That we have to do, and to do that we have to be engaged, active citizens. And that's going to be a tough one for us because for the past several generations, we've been going in the opposite direction. So it doesn't mean the trains are reversible, but we've got to wake up and smell some coffee. I want to thank you for your time. I'll take a couple of questions if you are ready. Your hand shot up, sir, and then I'll get someone on that side. Let's make it quick, though. That's an interesting theory. I don't think I agree with it, but I haven't really researched it. I don't know of any evidence to show that our nukes actually were not active. I'll get you in a minute, ma'am. My take on this is that, yes, these objects have been able to interfere with our nuclear missiles. We have this on a number of occasions, not just the famous 1967 incident, but some others as well. And not only us, but the Soviets have a couple of cases of parent tampering with codes and so forth, and sometimes in really scary ways. But it doesn't mean to me, I've never seen evidence that has disabled our nuclear capability. I mean, after all, the U.S. has detonated, we openly detonated tons and tons of nukes right through the end of the 1990s. From 1945 to the end of the 90s, there were over 2,000 nuclear detonations on planet Earth. Over 2,000. Go on to YouTube, you can see a kind of a recreation of it. It's disturbing. So they weren't stopping all of that. They weren't stopping our active, detonation of these nukes. So I don't really know what the deal is with all of that. I have a whole other take on North Korea, but I don't think I have time for that one, so I'll have to spare you. But there's a question by you in the back, ma'am. If you could speak up, that would be good. And this was you, I'm guessing. When did this happen? Did I understand you? Did you say it came out of the water, or did I mishear you? Did I understand you to say that it came out of water, or did I mishear you? Did it come out of the water by any chance? I'm just wondering. Oh, ice. Well, let me just... What year? I will thank you for that. There are stories, many. Yeah. I'll guarantee you there's folks here probably could talk to you privately about this later. I'd be happy to. We're doing thank you, meet the speakers. Hang on, since I got you all here, you can find me if you want to we're having a meet the speakers at 7, is that right, Chuck? At the Hampton Inn. At the Hampton Inn, which is just down the road. That's 7 o'clock. So if you're interested, go sign up for it. They'll be right at the front door. What I wanted to say to that is that there are huge amounts of stories that are very similar to what you're saying. Go. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to add very quickly, there's enormous numbers of UFO reports of objects coming out of large bodies of water, over lakes. I live in Rochester, New York. I know a lady who told me about a sighting she had in her backyard. of a craft that came right down, right at her house for about 10 minutes, similar to yours, and it just took off, and she's... Right. All right, I've got time for one or two more questions. Sir, and then I'll get you, ma'am, and I'll get you. We'll do three. Yes, sir, quickly. Yeah, I'll quickly. So the question is, do I believe that there was a meeting in 1954 by President Dwight Eisenhower with extraterrestrials or aliens at Edwards Air Force Base, and what happened there? I think, actually, if I were to say the answer, I would say I believe that. I do believe that. It's interesting to know that rumors of something came out almost immediately. They came out on the radio by a man named Frank Edwards, who, before there was Art Bell, there was Frank Edwards. Very deeply involved in this, and he'd heard stories that this was in fact the case. If you go into the details into the archives even now, it's very sketchy what was actually going on there. This is February 1954, and there are a few alleged eyewitnesses who've talked about this, and I'm inclined to think that it did happen. Yes, you, ma'am, and then I'll get you, sir. Yes. Speak up if you can, please. I could not hear you. Say again, please. No, I don't think so. The question is the Axelrod I mentioned, the one who worked with Hillary Clinton? Not to my knowledge, no. The Axelrod that I mentioned with Ingo Swann, that was 1975, and he knew Ingo through the late 70s. They had a couple of different interactions. Very interesting, very mysterious. I wrote about it in one of my books, Volume 2 of UFOs in the National Security State. No, he was kind of off the chain, this guy. I don't know where he was from, but I don't know if he was even human. Yes? Well, the whole Hillary UFO disclosure thing, my opinion is that I never believed that she was ever truly interested in doing that. Her campaign manager, John Podesta, famously is very interested in UFOs. He's a big fan of the X-Files, and has talked publicly a few times about the need for UFO, and even uses the word disclosure. And he was her campaign manager. He was also Barack Obama's transition chief in '08, and was Bill Clinton's chief of staff during the Clinton presidency. So Podesta's a powerful guy. And, Hillary Clinton, of course, went on the Jimmy Kimmel show and described UFOs as UAP, unexplained aerial phenomena, correctly using that term. That is a term that the military uses now. But whether she was really interested in doing disclosure, I personally do not believe that that was ever going to happen. That's a whole other question. Were you the one, or was there someone over there?
I was on the side.
Okay, quickly, yes.
Yeah, quickly, I want to see, are you planning on collaborating with Daniel Sheehan, or have you collaborated with him? He's a hero of our Boston 9/11 Truth folks.
Daniel Sheehan and I are very good friends. I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. He's an attorney who worked with the Karen Silkwood case way back and has done tremendous amount of powerful activist legal work over the years. Danny's, among all people I've ever met, is the single most knowledgeable person on the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. Unbelievable amount of detailed knowledge he's had, and on so many other things. I love Danny. I don't have any plans to do a project with him, but I would absolutely be open to it if the idea were right and if we were able to figure it out. So I have a mad respect for Danny Sheehan. I don't know how many more questions we have time for. I got to wrap it up. I'm going to take one more. Are you up in the back? Speak up if you can, and then we're done. Right. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. This is why I'm thinking the whole aliens are going to control our nukes thesis. I've never really found it that credible. There have been cases where the evidence seems that they've been interested in our nuclear technology. There's a very high percentage of UFO cases over sensitive nuclear technology. So there's something going on there. In fact, there's a very good statistical analysis that was done of that on one occasion. So there's an interest, but total control, I agree with you. I don't think that there is. That's all I have the time for. Thank you so much. Kathleen Martin is next. We'll be talking. So there's an interest. I agree with you. I don't think that there. Thank you so much.